Thank you all for coming. My name is Bashir Abu Manni, and I'm the head of School of English, and this is Amy Sackville, deputy head of the school. Welcome, Abdulrazak.
Thank you.
The Nobel is just an excuse just to get you back to Kent. So. Thank you for being here. I bet it feels like the whole world has landed on your doorstep in November, and it's been a roller coaster ride ever since, so we really appreciate the time that you're taking to spend with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for the welcome.
So Abdulrazak Gurna doesn't need an introduction, but we're going to give him an introduction anyway. He's Nobel laureate in literature, 2001. He was born in Zanzibar in 1948, off the coast of East Africa. He came to Britain as a student in 1968 and has taught for many years in the School of English at the University of Kent, retiring as Professor of English Literature and Postcolonial Literature in 2017. Abdulrazak is author of 10 novels which grapple with questions of belonging, colonialism, displacement, memory, and migration. His first 3 novels, Memory of Departure, 1987, Pilgrim's Way, 1988, and Doughty, 1990, document the immigrant experience in contemporary Britain. His 4th novel, Paradise, which was published in 1994, is set in colonial East Africa during the First World War and was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. Admiring Silence was published in 1996, tells the story of a young man who leaves Zanzibar and immigrates to England, where he marries and becomes a teacher, and then he returns to his native country 20 years later and experiences a profound change. By the Sea is 2001, narrated by Saleh Omar, an elderly asylum seeker living in an English seaside town. Gurna's latest novels are Desertion, 2005, shortlisted for the 2006 Commonwealth Writers' Prize. The Last Gift, 2011, Gravel Heart, 2018, and most recently Afterlives, which was published last year, which tells the story of colonial Askari boys recruited to fight during World War I in East Africa. Abdulrazak also edited 2 volumes of essays on African writing and has published articles on contemporary writers, post-colonial writers, including Naipaul, Salman Rushdie, and Zoe Wickham, and has also edited the Cambridge Companion to Salman Rushdie. So today's format is very simple. I'm going to ask a couple of contextual questions, and then Amy is going to ask more specific questions about writing. We also have received questions from people from around the world through the British Council, so we will also be able to ask some of those questions. And then in between my questions and Amy's questions, Abdulrazak has obliged us in reading a short segment of Afterlives. So this is the first question. So I want to begin with Zanzibar. I want to begin with departure. I want to begin with homeland, with leaving a country, with leaving a society, with how one leaves. So the question is, how would you describe the process of departure? Are there different categories of leaving for you? Your novels suggest that departure is always much more difficult than you imagine when you embark on it. So I wanted to think about that.
I didn't think you were going to get to that question.
I know, right?
Well, arrival, of course, is the end of a process or the end of a journey. I think during the process, particularly when you're young, and I think here also so many of these young people we read about doing that now, you don't think about what you're leaving. I don't think so. I don't think I thought about what I was leaving. You think about arrival. You think about destinations. Even if the destinations themselves are probably very imprecise or even a matter of chance. But I think once you're out and on the road, as it were, then I'm quite sure that what you're leaving behind begins to become clearer. So I think arrival, I know for me, was also a recognition of what has been lost. So sure, departure is, unfortunately, as I say, especially when you're young, these are not things you think about. Mm. And I'm quite sure that for a lot of people who end up displaced, that is displaced in the sense of being forced by circumstances, by violence, or by war, or by economic need, rather than by choice, because I don't consider these to be choices. I'm quite sure that because of the pressure to leave, then you don't think about what you're leaving until it's too late.
But you return to it in writing. You invoke it. You think about it. You dwell on it. When does that begin for you?
Well, it takes a long time to get to the point where you can invoke it or talk about it with with a sense of restitution, as opposed to with just that sense of loss I described. But I don't suppose that it ever quite stops, being some kind of a hard lump, as it were, that can't be quite digested.
I find there's an age question. At the beginning, you think about it much less. And then there comes a point in your life where you think about it all the time. You think about your childhood, and you dwell on those memories, and they're much more vivid in your mind.
Yeah, when you're young, you don't know what you're doing.
Exactly.
And in any case, you imagine, as again, I'm thinking of so many of these young people, thinking of myself. I came here when I was 18 years old, with not very clear ideas of what this place was like, or without very much money, or without any skills, without anything. It takes a long time before you can have time to reflect, because so much of the time you're just coping, you're just getting on with things, if you're lucky. So by the time you get to the point of reflecting, you've already somehow come through to the other side, in a sense.
This is a shorter question.
Okay. I can string it out if you want to.
I don't want to ask you about arrival, but if you want to say more about what it felt to arrive here, and how that initial experience was, because you said it could be just luck. You leave and then you get somewhere.
Yeah, well, it was quite difficult, but I don't suppose it's easy to be a stranger, particularly a stranger in a place that is so strange, that is to say, so unlike your own knowledge and experience of things. But it wasn't all kind of tragedy, as it were. In fact, it's more on reflection that it seems more tragic.
You didn't feel it at the time?
Well, at the time there were other things. It was quite exciting in some way to be in a place so different. And even if there were difficulties, and even if people were... Fortunately, you didn't always understand everything that people were saying. You didn't understand the full meaning of what they were saying. Maybe an abusive word here or there that you think, oh, you can't miss that. But the other things, other kinds of everyday hostilities, you didn't always understand them. And so you kind of brazen through things. And, but it was exciting. It was exciting to be in a place so different, and doing so many different things, and a certain kind of freedom that I hadn't experienced before. So
the second difficulty, I think Raymond Williams would use the word difficulty, right, is belonging. So what does belonging mean for you? Is it a political category? Is it about rights? Is it a more of a cultural feeling? In a sense, what I'm asking is whether belonging after exile is possible. Can you ever regain that deep sense of, which is in part what I think about when I think about this category of living in a society, right, which you have lost, but now living in a society in a strange place, disconnected, having to build from scratch somewhere else. Is it a loss that can be rectified?
Up to a point. Up to a point. But it also, what it does is also, of course, it opens up your understanding, or if you like, your consciousness of what it means to say that. Nor is it necessarily a tragic thing. It can be, of course it can be. But I know that there is a difference between feeling a complete stranger and unable to reconnect, and then to reconnect with where you came from, which was the case for me for many decades, and then being able to do so. And so you get something back. But, right. but in fact, I'm not sure if there is a sort of a benign form of belonging anyway, even if you stay put and sit tight, as it were. I'm not sure if you can just say, yep, this is where I am, and this is where I belong, and everything's fine. I'm not really sure if that's possible for most people, or at least for certain kinds of people anyway. It may be possible for others. So it's not that it's, I mean, there is something tragic, of course, about displacement. There is absolutely, without question, something tragic about displacement. But with luck, you can, I suppose, retrieve something. And this is, well, I suppose, in what I've been writing, this is what I've been wanting to say.
That there's a process of retrieval.
That there is a possibility of retrieving something from trauma.
Yeah. I always felt that even though you're not a declarative political writer, your work is profoundly political. So justice matters to you. Not only historic, for example, against imperial or colonial or racial forms of domination, but this much smaller category of individual justice. So the question is, why are you troubled by injustice? And to take it to the answer before, what's a just society for you?
The question was justice. I think we see what we see in front of us. So I don't know if I can say what is justice and what is just and what is not, but it always feels very important to me as a writer to say that I'm speaking as truthfully as I can. So if I see injustice, then that is what I will address. I will speak about it. But rather than that, I have a larger conception of justice. You see it. You don't have to be particularly bright-eyed, as it were, to see what's wrong with the way people are treated. When, as I mentioned earlier, when they're trying to escape from violence or from war or from need, you don't say to them, no, you're criminals. You've only come here to steal from us or something like that. That can't be justice. Nor can it be justice when you see people being deprived of, quite available, these are rich countries. It's not as if they're poor. Nor is it right or just when you see people coming and being treated as if they're beggars, when in fact they're saying, I've got something to give. So, in that sense, you don't need a kind of special understanding, to say this is unjust and I'm going to say something about it.
But it's a disposition, right? Not everyone sees it. Not everyone dwells on it. Not everyone registers. And that's part of the problem, right? Part of the problem is it's not expansive as a...
Or they're perhaps considering and thinking about themselves in a different way, or their concerns in a different way. Or they're misinformed by people who should inform them differently. So it may not be malice that results in this. It may be, I don't want to sound condescending by saying it's ignorance, but it may be misinformation, which may be also a historical misinformation and not just simply what's in the news.
So this question is about your, to put it in somewhat grand terms,
Go for it.
Go for it. Yeah, I know. It is about your intellectual intervention.
Like
exactly, right? Not run-of-the-mill stuff. In the British Academy. So it's about the critical side of what you do. You have 2 books on literary criticism, on African literature, one on Rushdie. One of my favorite pieces, critical pieces by you, is your Penguin introduction to Ngugi's A Grain of Wheat, which talks about the Mau Mau rebellion and decolonization. So looking back historically at what you did in the 80s and the 90s, and from my generation, there are other concerns, but I want to think about that moment of initial, as it were, registering of these processes in the academy critically. How would you describe what you do as a literary critic? When you set out on your journey in the 1980s, how did you want to change? You looked at literary criticism, you looked at English literary studies and said, how do I want to change that? Did you want to change that? Was that the intention, or were you just...
Yeah, well, there were, of course, a lot of other people doing, with the beginning of us in the academy, I suppose, in Britain, of studying writings from Africa, from the Caribbean, and elsewhere, India, I guess, as well. It felt to me at the time that there was a way of looking at this writing, or looking at what this writing was addressing, which was incomplete in some way. There was a part of looking. I mean, for example, there was very little about the world I knew. Thinking if we're talking about African writing, say, there was very little there that reflected the kind of world I grew up in or understood. Is cosmopolitanism, for example, Islam, or indeed a certain way of thinking about colonialism. So I wanted to make sure that that I would also be able to contribute something to this presentation. So it's not to say that what was there was mistaken, or at least not always. I felt at times it was, but at least not always. Particularly when you think about what criticism was doing, as opposed to what the novels or the poems were doing. So yeah, what was to be done was that, to say, look, there is another way of another part of the world, by which I don't mean geographical part of the world. I mean part of the world which is also about culture and about history, which is not being seen yet. So I guess that was the motivation to a certain extent, to say, to be more receptive to a less parochial way of thinking about Africa, or thinking about culture in Africa, and in particular thinking about writing.
So there's Indian Ocean, there's cosmopolitanism, there's
for example,
Islam embedded in that. And part of the process is telling that neglected story, that overlooked story.
And also studying it. So you're asking about the criticism, also paying attention and being alert and hearing when that is what is happening, rather than wanting to simplify the issue into simply a colonial encounter between Europe and Africa, although that, of course, was not a simple matter, but wanting to speak about a longer term encounter with other cultures, that very often these encounters were productive rather than traumatic. Let me read you something.
Yeah.
Otherwise, he's going to ask me
I
a
know,
question.
it's terrible.
Yeah, so this is from Afterlife. Bashir suggested I read something about the war. So I'll just give him a couple of paragraphs of that, then I'll read something else. So just to make him happy. So for those of you who are not familiar with the book or haven't read anything at all about it, it's set during the period of the 1914-1918 war, and it's happening in what was then called Deutsch Ostafrika, now, or rather later than Tanganyika, and now Tanzania. The war started 2 days later. The telegram orders arrived the morning after they returned from maneuvers. They were to take the train to Moshi and then march to positions near the border to reinforce the defensive line. The orders were carried out with trained and practiced precision. The troops marched from the boma to the town in close formation, singing their marching songs while the officers rode ahead of them or strode beside them. The carrier corps, the wives and children and livestock came behind them, so that by the time everyone was boarded, the train was so full that the carriers and the gunboys had to ride on the roof. After Moshi, they marched north towards the border with British East Africa. That was how that part of the world was at that time. Every bit of it belonged to Europeans, at least on a map. British East Africa, Deutsch Ostafrika, Africa Oriental Portuguesa, Congo Belge. The column of 150 askari stretched for a mile or more with the addition of all the followers. The askari were at the front of the column with the officers riding ahead and the staff surgeons and medical orderlies immediately behind them. That was always the formation on a march and in battle. Then came the carriers bringing equipment, ammunition, supplies, and the officers' personal effects. Behind them came the camp followers with a small group of askari under a German officer as a rear guard to counter desertion and pilfering. So that's the opening of the war. The central figure in the novel, or one of the central figures in the novel, is a soldier, is an askari as well, Hamza, his name is. So part of the novel tells of his experience during the war as a soldier. Now, at this point, after the war is over, he was injured during the war, and he's returning to a town that he had lived in as a much younger person, which is in fact the location where most of the novel takes place, a town on the coast. Their boat rounded the breakwater in evening twilight, and then Ahoza ordered the sail lowered as he made a cautious approach into harbor. The tide was out, and he was not sure of the channels, he said. It was after the Kaskazi monsoon and in the period before the winds and currents turned southeasterly. Heavy currents at that time of year sometimes shifted the channels. His boat was heavily laden, and he didn't want to get stuck on a sandbank or to hit something on the bottom. In the end, after debating the matter with his crew, he thought it was too dark to approach the quay in safety. So they dropped anchor in shallow water and waited for morning. There were lights on ashore and a few people moving about on the quay. The elongated shadows stretched out ahead and behind them in the gloom. Beyond the quayside, Beyond the quayside warehouses, the town sprawled, and the sky was amber from the glow of the setting sun. Further to the right, the dimly lit shoreline road shaped the way towards the headland, which after a while ran out to the darkness of the country. Hamza remembered that from the time before, how the road ran past the house where he lived, and how then it narrowed down to the tight aperture that opened out into the interior. Out to sea, the sky filled with stars, and a huge moon began to rise, illuminating the heaving water beyond the breakwater and the frothing crest of the reef in the distance. As the moon rose higher, it submerged the whole world in its unearthly glow, turning the warehouses and the quayside and the boats tied up alongside into insubstantial silhouettes of themselves. By then, the Nahodha and his 3 crew members had eaten their meager ration of rice and salt fish, which they shared with him, and settled themselves to rest, stretching out in a tight cluster on the sacks of millet and lentils which were their cargo. So he lay close too, listening to their conversation and their profanities and their gloomy, homesick songs, while the boat pitched with the surge of the incoming tide. Thank you.
Beautiful, thank you. I want to ask you some questions about process and
Sure.
writing craft, in the hope that I might learn something, maybe. I will try not to keep
This
you
is
too
going
long.
to be a creative writing class.
In disguise, finally. So, firstly, to think there are some abiding concerns in your work, as we've discussed, not only with arrival and departure, with travel, with cosmopolitanism, those questions, but the novels themselves, perhaps because of the nature of those themes, occupy a huge range of spaces and places and periods and narrative voices. They vary considerably in scale, spatially and temporally. I think the way that you occupy domestic and material and intimate spaces alongside these very wide historical realities is an extraordinary element of your writing. So a sort of dingy sitting room is rendered as vividly as a particularly memorable hyena-infested riverbank. So I'm just curious about, you started to say that as you're cooking, maybe some ideas appear and you start to make notes. I'm wondering if you can say more about where your first impulse towards a story comes from. This is a very elaborate way of asking, where do you get your ideas from?
Well, they take a while. Sometimes, you're just lucky, just a thought occurs. But quite often they're kind of lingering things that have been around for quite some time before you actually get to write about it. Well, take an example of something like Afterlives. You may remember, if you've read it, you may remember that Paradise ends with the recruitment drive. It's just the beginning of the war. There's noises about the war. Several times in the novel it's talked about as a possibility of a war coming. And that it ends with that recruitment drive, which also then prompts Yusuf, the figure in that novel, to run away and join the recruiters. So that was actually where I began to write Paradise. The very first thing I wrote was that. And it was a long, long time before I actually started writing the novel itself. It's because I wanted to write about that war. So way back, this would have been, I think when I wrote that paragraph, that passage, which is more or less intact. I still have it in my notes. That would have been something like about 1984. And Paradise was actually published in the end in 1994. It was actually, I finished writing it by about 1991 or 2, but it took a while, as it often does, for the book to actually be a book. But anyway, I wanted to write about the war. Partly it's because I grew up with stories of that, of those wars. We grew up with stories of what the Germans were like. In Kiswahili, the Germans are called Wadachi. So for a while as a child, I was confused because I thought Wadachi meant the Dutch, but it didn't. It meant the Deutsch, the German. So we used to hear stories from, as children, from people either who had experienced something of the Wadachi and their ferocity and their sternness and the military, whatever. And then I also had a relative who had been a conscript in the German carrier corps, as it were. He survived. Many people didn't, particularly in the carrier corps. I had an uncle who volunteered to join the KAR, the British army. So there were these kind of incomplete things I knew about, I had heard about. And of course people were talking about these things. And of course there were other monuments of the presence of the Germans and the British and the whatever. But I didn't really know enough about, and I tried to find out, but it wasn't probably the right time to do it. But what was much more interesting was to think about, so how did somebody who's like 17 or 18, like this boy Yusuf, how did he get to that place, to that point where he chooses to go and join up? And so that's how I wrote Paradise, really, is to write about that boy. So then for years and years and years, I think, so what happened? Not so much what happened to Yusuf, but what happened to people like him. Those people, because a lot of people did volunteer, did join up. And there are a number of interesting questions about this, like, why did they do that? The war in Tanganyika, or in Deutsche West Africa, as it then was, Tanganyika, it didn't become Tanganyika till 1926, where after the mandate, the UN mandate was given, Tanganyika was, or rather that Deutsche West Africa was given to the British as a mandate of the League of Nations. And then they changed the name to Tanganyika. But in any case, that war was fought by Africans on the one side, and by Africans and Indians on the other side. Why did they do that? So that was an interesting question to address. Why did they? It took a while, of course, to learn enough about these things, to think hard about these things. So in answer to the question, which is a long answer, but in answer to the question is that it takes a while. It takes a while of thinking things through, and sometimes years until the right sort of trigger, I suppose, the right combination of, I don't have another book to write. Okay, I'll write that one. That sort of thing. So
there's a curiosity that's sort of lingering, or...
Yeah, there are other ideas still, sort of now and then I think the drawer is empty, but then I think, no, it's not. There's that. What's not always available, of course, is the time and the space and the sort of the mental energy, as it were, to concentrate on that, whatever it is, and to actually make it happen.
Which leads to my next question, perhaps. In your Nobel lecture, you describe how you started to write out of a sense of necessity, that the pull of your own memories became impossible to resist, but also how you were sort of seeing a simpler history that was being written and this is partly what you were speaking about in your criticism as well, not only by the victors but by other scholars and writers, and that it became necessary for you to write. And I thought that's a really interesting word, necessity, that there's both an internal compulsion, which perhaps is this curiosity you're speaking about, but also a sense that things are incomplete and that there are spaces to be filled. So my question really is, do you still feel that sense of necessity, and does it change over time? How do you recognize it when it arrives?
Well, I mean, in the case of, say, once again, to return to Afterlives, very little is known about this period. It's not that scholars don't know about it, but I mean, in a popular sense, very little is known about it, especially when quite recently, of course, there were all these sort of remembering the First World War and whatever. But I don't know, I think if there was anybody representing soldiers of that war, there would perhaps have been one odd one somewhere in the back row somewhere. But it's not something that is known about a lot. So that's a necessity, in a sense, to say, here's something you should know about. And I, for example, myself didn't know just the extent of the casualties of that war. Its representation in, certainly in Britain, let alone in Germany, which we'll come to in a second, but its representation, I'm almost leading a seminar there, we'll come to that in a second. Its representation in British culture, or rather in Western culture, for a moment if we leave Germany aside as the former colonial power, is kind of to trivialize it. The African Queen, I don't know if any of you know The African Queen, but as a book by C.S. Forrester, which was made into a film with Humphrey Bogart and somebody else, I can't remember who, Catherine Hepburn, exactly, yeah. So it's really all about them, if you like. William Boyd wrote An Ice Cream War, which is, even the title already suggests this is a picnic. But in reality, hundreds of thousands of people died. But they were all Africans and all native people. It's not so interesting. So there's another necessity to speak about that.
Yes, absolutely.
Germany.
Oh, yes.
Germany, Germany had completely, really, in almost every sense of popular knowledge, wiped out that war until recently. And recently, there has been, well, I mean, in a way you can understand, recovering from the horrors of what they had done, or what had been done, if not they themselves, of course it was a different generation, but what had been done in the name of Germany during the 1940s and 30s and so on. They had a much bigger problem to deal with in the sense of what to remember and what not to remember and what to work out. But nonetheless, here was this. And now there is, I believe, a great deal of interest and concern about German imperialism in Africa.
So I want to think about the novel form. So of course you're a critic and a scholar. You've written short fiction. You told me earlier that the first time you stood on this stage was when appearing in a play that you wrote.
That's right, yeah.
So you're also a playwright. But the novel seems to be the form that you are at home in as a creative writer. What is it about the novel? What does it offer you as a space to write in?
Well, I can answer that by saying, first of all, that the playwright, as it were, was a very brief, short road, precisely because, and other people find this a benefit, but I didn't, precisely because you have to rely on other people. And other people are not always reliable. And also they want to interpret things. And so on. So the one advantage of writing a novel is that nobody messes you around. You know, you can just, you can write, well, until the editor gets their hands on it, of course. But you can write and write what you want to say until you feel you have done so. That's one thing. The other thing is that I think of, I'm not saying plays are not like that, so we'll forget the playwright thing. It was just an aberration of my youth. The other thing about a novel is that because it has this, its canvas, as it were, is so broad and so permissive, there's, to a certain extent, really not very much limit to what you can do in terms of reflection and exploration and writing and so on. That's what I really like about.
Has your sense of the form changed, do you think, over the time you've been writing? Do you want to do different things with it?
Yeah, well, I'm sure it has, yeah. I'm sure that I feel much less restricted, I suppose. There were certain things I thought you had to be sure you do. I didn't always obey, but you felt you had to make sure that you do this, you do that, you explain things, make sure the connections are whatever. Don't be too prosaic, in a sense. Whereas now I think, well, if you need to know, you need to know. And yeah. I will. The only way of telling you about this is to tell you about it. So yeah, I think, but that comes with a certain degree of security in your voice, I think, and in thinking that I can do it, I can deliver it somehow, even though this is not showing. This thing, creative writer, show, don't tell, show, don't tell, show, this kind of thing.
We don't say that anymore.
So things, I think, well, no, there are certain times when you have to be told certain things.
Yes. That's the new message.
Is it?
Sometimes it's okay to tell.
Okay.
You're on message. It's so I'm very conscious that people in the audience will have questions, so I just have one more thing that I'd like to ask you. So the Nobel, of course, is awarded in recognition of a body of work and of the significance of your contribution to literature rather than being a single novel. It's recognising the integrity with which you've addressed your writing over so many of these beautiful novels, as well as the particular way that that body of work has something to say to the world as it is now. I saw the Australian writer David Malouf speaking a couple of years ago, and he was speaking about having the idea of a body of work and that each new work that you write speaks to and changes the ones that have come before. So I'm interested if you agree with that idea and if you have a sense of what your body of work is, how it exists in the world now, and how perhaps it's been changed by the recognition of the Nobel.
I agree with everything David Malouf says. Really, I do. He's a good man. So is the question to do with how the Nobel changes the body of work, something like that?
Yes. I suppose as a writer, you're just writing the next book and writing the next book, and whether it's made you think about it as a body of work and reflect on what it stands for.
Well, it certainly made me think more kindly about my body of work. Thinking, well, maybe it wasn't too bad after all. You do, at least I think I do. You do tend to be rather critical of what you do, and thinking, well, I don't think I can look at that book. Not to say that I have looked at those books, but all these books have been reissued, which is absolutely wonderful, because so many of them, even here in the UK, I think the first 3 or even 4 books have been out of print for generations. And in a way, you think, well, they don't deserve to. And then they bring them out and you think, that's the Nobel. These are good books.
Validation.
So yeah, I think it does make a difference.
So a question that actually came to us from a reader in Tanzania, which I also had, which was, how would you advise a young or a new writer starting out who's maybe feeling that call of the compulsion or necessity? How do you follow that first impulse, but also sustain that energy and integrity that you have sustained to keep pursuing a vision?
I'm afraid the only answer I have to that, which I which comes up now and then, people ask that question, is just write. I don't think there is anything else you can do. You just have to write and write and write until it works. Or alternatively, it doesn't. And you say, well, maybe this is not the right thing. But I don't think there is any other advice.
I was really hoping you'd have the magic answer.
The secret. Amy's looking for the secret.
Please join us in our very heartfelt thanks to Nobel laureate Professor Abdulrazak Gurnah.